best version of me to get. The anniversary of Katrina for me also marks the 20th anniversary of not only opening up the Astrodome in Houston for our neighbors in Louisiana and Mississippi, but also 20 years in the disaster space. And so, when it comes to topics like this, really my insights have been formed by that history. My career started with a storm on the Texas-Louisiana border. It's been defined by storms on the Texas-Louisiana border, and will likely end with a storm on the Texas-Louisiana border. What's very interesting about conversations like this and where we are right now in the disaster space, my career in my early 20s started in politics. I abandoned that in my late 20s for a real job, and then found myself full circle as an appointee of the former president. I say that because emergency management is a lot like politics. It's a game of addition. How many people can you get on the team with the skill sets you need to be able to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish? And emergency management and the complexities that we're facing in this field are very much like that. And I've always valued the partnerships between government and philanthropy and the business sector. But that's not always the case in this field. It's not universal. But I think now, while it's as good a time as any to continue to push that, we are in an ideal time to lean into fostering those kinds of relationships and partnerships. You mentioned the signing with PaaL and the SBA. Those are the kinds of partnerships that are absolutely essential, whether state, local, or federal level, to tackle the challenges that we have. Because the challenges we're facing are more frequent. The implications are vast, and certainly the scale is substantial. And I say this about the practice of emergency management itself, but it's also essential to the technology and the tools that we utilize. And the topics that you're talking about today and this week are absolutely critical because the ability to get communities back on their feet as quickly as possible to help them become stronger for the storms to come really comes to access to capital, not only how we fund local, state, and federal responses, but also how we get that into the hands of people that need it the most. And again, that is where your work here is absolutely essential. Funds going to the right people at the right time for the right purpose. For a little bit of context of kind of where we are and how we utilize not only technology, but kind of data and information that we need to execute this, to explain the landscape. Just about a decade ago, we were making high impact, high consequence decisions in a condensed time frame with not a whole lot of information on the emergency management and the disaster side. And fast forward to today, we're still making high impact, high consequence decisions in a condensed time frame with a lot of information, in some cases too much information. So how do we harness that to make sure that the blind spot really still is information? How we do that to make sure that we're utilizing the technology and the expertise to jumpstart recoveries is absolutely critical. And so as you have these discussions, the context I think is important is, the changing federal landscape. I joke about where this will end up, but the direction is clear. Less reliance on the federal government and more responsibility on states and locals. And in general, and I tend to agree with that assumption. I think what is the mantra? Federally supported, state managed, and locally executed. Having been both at state, local, and federal levels, and the private sector, all disasters are local. That is where those are the communities that know their needs best. Those are the ones that have to live with the short-term and long-term consequences of how we address recovery and how good we do a job across the spectrum of those of us involved in disaster, of how we fuel the recovery. One of the things I think is particularly critical, and while we spend a lot of state, local, and federal dollars to restore infrastructure for midterm and long-term recovery on housing and other issues, getting the capital in the hands of those people that need it the most as quickly as possible. There's potentially some big changes on the way, but those are in the face of very existing big challenges. Just look at the billion-dollar disasters that we had about 10 years ago. We had a billion-dollar disaster on average about every 6 to 8 weeks. Right now, we are averaging $1 billion disaster, I guess, probably what is about 3 to 4 weeks. And if my math is right, I'm trying to do some conservative math here, it's probably in the next 5 years, we'll be in the range of $1 billion disaster about every 5 to 7 to 8 days. And when it comes to managing those resources, capital in particular, and funding, it's more critical than ever, especially if we see those disasters happening sometimes back to back. About this time last year, I was on the ground in about 4 states that had each at least 3 presidentially declared disasters at the same time. Some in the same similar parts of the state, some in totally opposite parts of the state. So my context and how you look at this work can be helpful. What we know about getting local economies back on their feet is this: out of almost 3,000 county level recoveries for $1 billion disasters, a study found distinct differences between what we call leading recoveries and lagging recoveries. And financial literacy is absolutely essential. But in terms of lagging recoveries and leading recoveries, what that tells us is out of those 3,000 county level $1 billion disaster recoveries, only about 25% of those were doing better 5 years after impact than they were doing before impact. And by that I mean today, the storm comes tomorrow, only 25% of those 5 years later, by leading recovery I mean they had higher GDP, lower poverty, and increased employment, right? Only 25% of those disasters, roughly, were experiencing that out of those 3,000 county level. 75% of those 5 years later still found themselves higher poverty, less employment, and lower GDP. And there are some things there are some common threads. One of those is very obvious things like, did they spend more money on mitigation to make sure they were stronger in the face of the storm to come? The other was how quickly they got money out the door. Were they able to get that money in the hands, whether it was individuals, whether it was institutions or governments, quickly enough to jumpstart that recovery? You did not have to get every decision right, but you needed to get the money out the door in the hands of those that knew the communities, that knew the mission to be able to accomplish that. And the other was the flexibility of rainy day funds. They had a certain percentage more invested in rainy day funds in those communities that had a lagging recovery, but also drilling down a bit more. Was those plans were flexible to be able to not only get the money out the door quickly, but to ensure that they were flexible in putting those dollars where they needed to be. And interestingly enough, to reference SBA, the other similarity, or the other distinct difference between those that were in a leading recovery as opposed to a lagging recovery was those that were better off 5 years later had a 19% uptake on SBA loans than communities that were not better off than they were before the disaster. And the other thing that I think particularly is helpful to these discussions, and as we look at how we put capital in the hands of those people that need it, is financial literacy. It's absolutely essential in an increasingly complicated financial scenarios for American consumers. And obviously SBA and potentially more with less, but at the very least, in addition to doing more, they'll be asked to do new things, and maybe things that they have not done before. So I think this is an ideal time to reach out to communities that are very likely to be impacted. Many along the Gulf Coast, we've got some wildfire communities out west that have demonstrated areas of innovation. And look at that, because I would tell you from the United Ways, the American Red Cross, not speaking for them, but also some of the community-based institutions that are trusted partners. I think they're willing to listen. And if there's an area that this has worked out well, whether it's, I think, in South Carolina, I think finding the first folks that are willing to take this on and building on that is absolutely essential. So I think people are willing to listen.
Excellent. Others with questions? There's lunch there.
Person?
Yeah.
Let me take advantage of Francisco being right down the road here, but being somebody who has been both a close friend and a mentor. One of the things that he humbly is not describing is the work that he worked on to really change the workflow, the process flow. I think most people don't recognize 70% of the losses on the insurance, whether it's federal or personally owned, 70% was around a home. And the SBA has played this role in helping recover and rebuild homes. The other part is that obviously small businesses, especially small businesses in low to moderate income neighborhoods, are so critical for long-term economic stability. So what I would pose to Francisco is, if you had to look a year from now and say, with a magic wand, all of this restructuring at the federal, state, and local level, what would be 2 or 3 things that would make this really work for a group like PaaL, its partners and relations, to help serve what you think the world should look like a year from now?
Yeah, so one, I think particularly with what PaaL does, you look at aside from what comes down from FEMA, the federal government for individual assistance, or what comes from SBA loan, there are often, I would zero in on those communities that have potentially have these huge recovery funds. You know, we're talking here, we've had a huge Katrina recovery fund, we had a huge Harvey recovery fund, which is putting cash, dollars, money in the hands of disaster survivors through those private funds. One, for a little bit of context, I think they often end up funding what the federal government or state government might come and do at some point, right? But it happens months down the road when the need is now. I think there's an incredible opportunity for PaaL and what PaaL brings to the table to work with those institutions. Those communities that already have recovery funds, you know, Houston, we've got, while one may be renamed based on the storm, we finally have the infrastructure to know who's going to manage the bank account, who's going to manage what the priorities are, and how is that money going to flow out into the community, sometimes directly into the hands of disaster survivors. So I think those are key markets for places like PaaL, or organizations like PaaL, to take a look at and say, outside of the federal government, we know these communities are going to be putting money in the hands of disaster survivors. And I think the selling point really is the infrastructure is there, the accountability is there, the integrity of the systems is there. And I think those would be a lot of value add to, you mentioned kind of here in the Houston area, the United Ways, for example, Greater Houston Community Foundations that are pivotal to how those monies are going to get out the door. It saves them some accounting, brings the lessons learned that PaaL continues to implement, right, as it does this disaster after disaster. So I think that's an area to focus on.
Thank you. Richard, anything else? Any questions? Thank you. This was a delightful surprise.
It was for me as well. Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate sorry to miss it. I look forward to seeing what comes out of it.
Well, you're invited to the next one.
Great.
Thank you. Lunch.
Help yourself. Get up to do things.